Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a minute. We're going to give a little bit of time for participants to enter today's webinar, but really excited to get started with you. All right, I see a few more people entering the waiting room, but in the interest of time, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you signing up for and participating in our webinar today. My name is Jamila Blake, she, her. I'm a project manager at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS for short. I serve as the Community Engagement Manager for the S-STEM Resource and Evaluation Center. Through the S-STEM Rec, AAAS is happy to facilitate this opportunity for you to ask your questions about the 2024 S-STEM solicitation and get them answered by NSF S-STEM Program Officers. We're really grateful for our partnership with NSF and their participation with us during today's webinar. Today we have Tom, Mike, and Elise, who are all from the S-STEM Program Officer team, who will be answering your questions later on during the webinar. So before we get started, I just want to go over some quick housekeeping items. Please make sure your microphone is muted, just so we don't couch any background noise throughout the day. If you're comfortable doing so, please turn on your camera to engage with us during today's discussion. The Q&A feature is enabled and should show up as an icon at the bottom of your screen. Please share your questions for NSF here rather than in the chat. It's never too early to add your questions, so please feel free to add those at any time. If you see a question that aligns to something you're thinking about or you think is a good question you'd like to hear the answer to, please give it a thumbs up in the Q&A feature. That way we're able to prioritize which questions we get through during today's session. In addition, our NSF colleagues will be answering some of the more direct questions in writing, so keep an eye on the open questions tab, but also the answered question tab. We also welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat. Feel free to rename yourself to also include your institution and pronouns if you feel comfortable sharing. We have enabled closed captioning, so please click on the CC icon in Zoom to turn them on if you don't already see them on your screen. And then if you run into any technical difficulties, please feel free to send an email to me at jblake@AAAS.org or to my colleague Rachel Stivers at rstivers@AAAS.org. You'll see Rachel is adding some information in the chat now. The event today is being recorded and the slides will be available on S-STEM Rec website. We really appreciate your feedback of the webinar itself as well. Let us know how useful it was for you, any suggestions you have to improve it. A short survey will appear when you leave the webinar, but if you're unable to take that today, a link will also be sent for the survey after today as well. For anyone who's just joining us, my name is Jamila Blake, she, her. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for the S-STEM Rec, and I am thrilled to be able to facilitate this proposal preparation webinar for the S-STEM program. As part of AAAS's work on the S-STEM Rec, which is made possible by funding from the National Science Foundation. This webinar series is our first event of 2024, and its aim is to provide individuals who are interested in submitting an S-STEM proposal the opportunity to ask questions about the solicitation and get them answered by our NSF program officers. Just let me get started by providing a quick overview of our agenda today. We'll start with an overview of the S-STEM Resource and Evaluation Center, the REC. Then I'll hand over the virtual microphone to our NSF colleagues to highlight the important changes in the solicitation for this year as compared to last year. After, we'll spend the bulk of today's discussion going through any questions you have for NSF. So as I already mentioned, please remember to use the Q&A feature to add any questions. You can add them in at any time throughout the webinar. You can also upvote other questions as well. So let's get started by giving you a sense of what the S-STEM Rec does. AAAS launched the Rec last year with funding awarded via an NSF grant to work on partnership with NSF to manage the first of its kind effort to support capacity building of S-STEM grantees and potential grantees, to build the capacity of scholars and to explore and increase the impacts of the S-STEM portfolio. We've created the infrastructure to build community and coordinate work as well as synthesize findings across over 600 funded S-STEM programs at different types of colleges and universities across the country. This next slide illustrates the range of activities that are managed by the REC. The REC will achieve its goal by carrying out 5 essential actions, which are depicted in the hexagons you can see on the screen. Specifically, the REC provides resources, knowledge, and connections to support S-STEM program leadership, provide professional development and career building opportunities for S-STEM scholars, community building and communications for coordination and awareness, and the synthesis of the evidence about the impact of the S-STEM programs. We welcome you to visit our website to learn more. You can also join our mailing list to stay updated and informed. And while the REC is managed by AAAS in coordination with NSF, we could not reach our goals without the significant contributions of our full team, which includes MN Associates, who lead the grantee and potential grantee evaluation capacity building efforts, AIR, which leads the assessment of the impact of the S-STEM portfolio, QEM Network, which informs our efforts to support and learn from a broad array of types of institutions, and CIRCE at the University of Washington, which is evaluating the REC. So before turning it over to NSF, I want to let you all know about a set of complimentary webinars that our partners at MN Associates will host on the topic of research and evaluation plans. A few members of the M&A team have joined us for today's webinar. Kavita, if you'd like to take a quick moment to unmute and say hello to everyone today, I'd like to give you that opportunity.
Thanks, Jamila. Hi, everyone. So if you have a moment and if you haven't already, please feel free to register for these 2 upcoming webinars on Feb 1st and Feb 8th. Tips on developing your research and evaluation plans and also developing and using a logic model for your S-STEM proposal. So see you there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kavita. You can find details about the webinars on our website, along with other resources such as FAQs about the generation of knowledge, design methodology, as well as budgeting. So please note that while we're promoting engagement with M&A as a REC partner, this does not indicate an endorsement as evaluators by NSF. And with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to Tom to discuss the 2024 S-STEM solicitation.
Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, if that is your time zone. My name is Tom Kim, and I am the lead program officer for the S-STEM program. And I'm going to share with you the most recent updates to the solicitation for the S-STEM program. That is NSF 24-511. That's the formal solicitation for the program. If you type in NSF 24-511 into Google, it will take you straight to the website. And therein is a copy of the full solicitation ready for your download. So new this year are just some small adjustments and changes. First, there is a rearrangement of deadlines. In the previous iteration of the solicitation, track 1 of the program had a deadline that was separate from tracks 2, 3, and collaborative planning grants. So to simplify work for us and also to clarify things a little bit more for all of you out there in higher education, there is one deadline. So there's only one date to remember, and that is March 11th for this upcoming submission deadline. In addition, there's been a reduction in track 2 in terms of its maximum dollar request. Track 2 proposals are now limited to $2 million, down from $2.5 million in the previous version of the solicitation. The last couple of changes are just a pair of minor functional differences in terms of proposal preparation. So in keeping with this overall theme for the webinar, there are 2 elements that used to be limited solely to the project description. And these 2 elements can now have the option of being incorporated as supplementary documents. thereby freeing up a little bit of page space for you to do the work of describing your project. Those two elements are specifically the data table that describes the demographics and numbers of eligible scholars, the historical data for eligible scholars at your institution. That table can be incorporated as a supplementary document. You can leave it in the project description if you just think that taking it out makes the flow of your narrative a little bit funky. The second item that can be moved to supplementary documents is the logic model that is required within the evaluation plan. Now, bear in mind, it is just the logic model. The overarching evaluation plan still must be incorporated as part of the project description. And pretty much everything else has stayed intact from the previous solicitation, which was 23-527. And so with that, I will pass the mic back. And I think we're going to get ready to answer some questions.
Thanks so much, Mike. Or Tom, my goodness. So for providing those details about the solicitation. Next, we're going to get started with the Q&A portion of the webinar. So as we've said before, and as you can see on the screen, please continue to add your questions to the Q&A box. Upvote the questions that have been asked and be sure to check for any answered questions that might have written responses. And we will go ahead and get started with our first question. So one of the questions that has been submitted asks, in the PowerPoint video presentation on the new S-STEM solicitation, it states that faculty involved in the research component of Track 3 proposals cannot act as external evaluators for the project or work. The question asks about the opposite scenario. Can information about the project generated via the external evaluation be used to inform the knowledge generation component? And should we describe the anticipated use in the proposal?
So I'll lead off. We don't really pre-plan these things all that much. So Sally, the answer to your question is you can certainly use any insights gleaned from the evaluation plan and wrap them into your research agenda. As is the case with almost every S-STEM project, what you think you're going to discover isn't going to match up precisely with what you actually do discover. And so we intend and allow for you to pivot when things go differently than you expect. And the knowledge generation part of Track 3 is no different than any other part of S-STEM. So if your evaluator provides you with some insight that was not originally part of your scope of research, you are welcome to pivot if need be, or just simply broaden your research plan to incorporate that new information. In terms of anticipating that sort of thing happening, once again, what you include in your proposal, regardless of how much care you put into it, is unlikely to be exactly comprehensively what actually ends up hitting the ground. So I wouldn't kvetch too much about getting everything right in terms of the research plan. The research plan should stand of its own accord, obviously, but don't spend too much time trying to anticipate every possible contingency.
All right, thanks, Tom. Our next question is, does a proposed co-PI have to meet the who may serve as PI eligibility requirements? Our proposed PI is an academic administrator who has taught in an S-STEM eligible discipline in the past 2 years. The proposed co-PI is an academic administrator too, but he has not taught in an S-STEM eligible discipline in the last 2 years. Does he qualify as a co-PI?
Answer to that is yes. The requirement for the PI is there so that at least one person meets the central requirements for what needs to be in place for an S-STEM project. Anyone in addition to that one person should align with whatever their role within the project scheme. And so they don't necessarily even have to be STEM faculty. If your project is delving into counseling for the scholars, then having a co-PI who is coming out of the counseling center or the counseling department of your institution is perfectly appropriate. So no, once you've covered all of the check boxes with regard to the PI's status, your co-PIs should be whomever is appropriate to the roles required in your proposal.
Great. Rolling right into our next question. In the supporting financial aid letter, how would you recommend using the new SAI to demonstrate that there is student need for involved programs? Should we include potential SAI numbers?
That I would say is up to your Office of Financial Aid, because they are going to have to use SAI in their future calculations. However, given that this is a transitional year and given that you might not actually have FAFSA data for incoming students by the time this proposal gets submitted, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, in terms of historical data, if you're trying to establish the validity of your prospective population, I think we could go with prior FAFSA calculations to establish the presence of the eligible pool. However, SAI is a requirement out of the new FAFSA, and so all future determinations must rely upon SAI in the calculation.
Thanks, Tom. And just a quick reminder, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A feature. We want to make sure we don't lose any of your very thoughtful questions in the chat as we're keeping track of everything that is being asked. Quick clarification, if you wouldn't mind providing this, Tom, what does SAI stand for?
SAI is short for Student Aid Index, and it is the value that is now going to be extracted out of the FAFSA application to determine a student's unmet need. Prior to this year, the value that was pulled out of FAFSA was the EFC, the Effective Family Contribution. With the change in the FAFSA formulation and legislation, EFC no longer exists, and therefore it can't be used for any determinations moving forward. So SAI is basically the new EFC. It's also better because it requires a lot less data, and I haven't actually crunched through the numbers, but it seems to make a little more sense. And it can actually be negative now, which was not the case with EFC.
Thank you for that clarification, Tom, and for helping us navigate through that alphabet soup. In the PowerPoint from the January 8th webinar, the page limit for the planning proposal differs from the solicitation. 6 pages in the PowerPoint, 8 in the solicitation. Which limit should we adhere to?
The solicitation is the final word on requirements for the program. And I've got to go back and edit the PowerPoint presentation because that's a screw up. That's on me. My apologies.
All right. Well, our next question is, we're considering an external evaluator that works at our university. She's located in a different department, strategic initiatives, from the project's home department, which is in School of Arts, Science, and Technology. The reporting lines are initially different. The potential evaluator reports to the Vice Provost for Strategic Initiatives and Institutional Effectiveness. The PI reports to the Dean of the school. The Vice Provost and the Dean, however, both report to the Provost. So we were wondering, is our proposed evaluator external enough to the project?
The answer is yes. Pretty much everybody's going to coalesce, if not at the Provost and eventually at the President. So that's enough degrees of separation that you don't have to worry about it.
Great.
Tom, if I can add one little bit, because there's a few questions about independence here. We're looking for independence in the ways that you described there, reporting up to different chains. But if we happen to note in the bio sketch for the evaluator or other information that we have that there's a bunch of co-authored papers between the evaluator and the PI or some other close working relationship, we would like that to be avoided as well, right? The idea is that the evaluator needs to be able to hold the project at arm's length so that they can give good news if things are working and maybe tough news if it's not. And what we found over time is that If your best bud is the evaluator, they might not want to give you the good news. Rather the bad news. Well, hopefully they want to give you the good news, but they might not want to give you the bad news because they don't want to hurt your feelings. But then the projects don't learn and grow.
Thanks for that additional advice there, Mike. The new solicitation states proposals should include the biographical sketches in NSF format of all key collaborators not included as senior key personnel, such as the external evaluator, advisory board members, or other consultants engaged with the project. Does that mean that all proposed advisory board members need to use the science CV to create a bio sketch for inclusion?
Not absolutely. So science CV is going to be absolutely necessary for those that are listed as PI and co-PI and senior personnel, because that's part of the actual data train and metadata that's associated with the proposal. If they are adjacent to the project, like the external advisor or external evaluator or advisory board members, you can use whatever templates out there for the standard NSF biosketch and simply upload them as supplementary documents. Supplementary documents are not something that have to go through that ultimate vetting process requiring the Science CV platform.
Great, thanks, Tom. Our next question is in section 4B, scholarship recipients. For the part about demonstrating unmet need for graduate students, it says, for graduate students, it is defined as financial eligibility for graduate assistance in areas of national need. It seemed like from other wording that using FAFSA data was fine, but the wording in the bullet seemed like graduate programs can use GAN or FA office. Has never heard of that, so we don't have that data. So I guess some additional guidance on how to provide this information for graduate student assistance specifically.
So the GAN suggestion is that it's a suggestion. It is a validated metric for establishing the low-income definition for graduate students. However, it is not necessary to use that alone. And so if you have an alternative metric that you can verify low-income status with, your financial aid office can use that metric instead of the GAN.
Great. All right, we'll move right into our next question. We're writing a proposal to support master's students. To show historical data on enrollment of eligible scholars, we need to determine which students were low income. The issue with this is that many of our grad students do not file FAFSA. Thus, I'm afraid we may not be able to fully report the number of low-income students we had on a specific term. Any suggestions on how to determine the number of low-income students?
At some juncture, you're going to have to extract some data about those students. I mean, you have to have authentic reporting to declare that you in fact have low-income students enrolled in your programs. One suggestion is to use a non-FAFSA dependent rubric to do that. So for instance, the TRIO program uses a percentage of the percentage of the federal poverty guidelines, which are a table of adjusted gross income published by the National Institutes of Health. Housing and Urban Development uses a median income metric to determine its Section 8 eligibility. So once again, if you look at the solicitation, it provides a list of potential metrics for determining low income. You can use any of those metrics to also establish the bona fides of your prospective pool of candidates.
Thanks, Tom. So our next question is, the number of low-income students table, is that required? On page 15, the solicitation says it should be included in this section, but on page 19, it says proposals may include the table regarding the potential pool of scholars.
So it is required. the option is to place it in the project description or to place it as a supplemental document. Okay, so that's why the option part is there. And the should be included in this section phrase is something that we missed in proofreading the solicitation after the change was made to make the supplementary document option available. So once again, my apologies, we whiffed. But yes, the table itself is required. Where you put it has a pair of options available to it.
Great clarification there.
Jamila?
Sure.
So I may just not be finding it off the top of my head. That might be language from a prior solicitation. I don't think there's at least a bracketed the table. What Tom's answer is 100% correct, but this is a good time, even if it is, and I've just missed it in my search. It's always good to just remind you to triple check the solicitation you're reading and working from before you submit. So I apologize if it is there, but Tom's answer is correct in governing, but just be sure that we're all looking at the same solicitation is good as well.
Can I add one comment about the table too quickly? Just this is me editorializing a little bit, but I think the purpose of the table is kind of twofold. Like I think on the one hand, I think it's good for you as your institution to kind of see the data and use that to sort of make the case for the number of scholars that you want, whether you can kind of fill the cohorts that you're proposing. And then I also think there's real value in like really demonstrating very clearly to reviewers exactly kind of your eligible pool and those numbers, and then that it's very clearly jumping off the page then what's kind of your cohort sizes in relation to the eligible pool. So it's not just sort of, you know, busy work that we want to do. It can be really effective to very clearly see and justify, like, yes, we have the students, and then that's the basis for the cohort and the scholarship sizes that we're recommending. So I think really see it as a way to efficiently communicate kind of the key information about your project.
Please, at any point, Elise, Mike, feel free to jump in as Tom and I are going through these questions. Our next one here is asking for a little bit of further clarification on financial aid letters. Should the eligible students population be defined based on SAI or in past EFC or COA minus SAI? And Tom, if you wouldn't mind maybe providing some also clarification of those abbreviations for anyone that's unfamiliar.
Okay. So there's actually two features of the program in play in this particular question. Okay. Two of the eligibility requirements that need to be established is one, your eligible scholars need to be low income as defined by the institution. And they have to have identified unmet need per the calculation of their financial aid package as established by your Office of Financial Aid. So eligibility of low income is going to be based on some sort of rubric. And in the past, a lot of institutions had used Pell eligibility as their benchmark for a low income definition, which is fine. There's no arguments about using Pell. It is a federally established program for low-income students. However, because Pell was calculated based on FAFSA data, the EFC was a necessary component to determine eligibility in terms of being low income. Also, the EFC is used to establish what the level of unmet need is for an individual student. And so when referring to past usage of the FAFSA, EFC was going to show up in both of those places. Now, I encourage you to have a very robust conversation with your financial aid offices because those two features are no longer consistent with what used to be the case. Okay, with the new FAFSA, the legislation basically changed up how Pell can be determined. And so moving forward, If you're going to use Pell eligibility, you're welcome to do that, by the way. Pell eligibility is determined and has nothing whatsoever to do with SAI, or what we would say is the new EFC. Pell eligibility is calculated based on that same federal poverty guideline that the TRIO program uses. And the levels of percent, it actually is an overage percent for Pell eligibility. That threshold is determined based on the adjusted gross income of the student's family or the student as an individual, period. You can actually determine Pell eligibility without doing FAFSA under the new regime. However, you still need the FAFSA, which now incorporates the SAI, the Student Aid Index, to determine what their unmet need is. Okay, so you can do eligibility without FAFSA. You must have FAFSA to do unmet need, because that's how financial aid does it. And for everybody out there who doesn't know, COA refers to cost of attendance. That is the sticker that financial aid establishes for the student's attendance at the institution. The SAI is how much the student is expected to come with. The gap between those two is the unmet need.
And Mike, I see you're unmuted.
So one other thing to just keep in mind, unmet need alone cannot be your low income definition. Just to reiterate that. Because unmet need is not strictly a factor of the income situation of the students. It is also a factor of the cost of your institution. If your institution costs $2 million a year, you could have pretty high unmet needs even for very financially well-off students. So just to reiterate that, because we do see that in a handful of proposals every year, that unmet need alone is being used to determine income status, and that is not appropriate. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for that additional guidance. So our next question is, would you recommend including fifth-year funding for a limited number of students who may not complete a degree in 4 years?
The answer to that is, it depends. If you have demographic data that demonstrates clearly that 40% of your students will take 5 years to graduate, and that overlaps with all of the other eligibility criteria for your scholars, then by all means, figure out how much money you're going to have to set up in a little side account to cover the 5th year for however many scholars you expect to need a 5th year. If you have a 4-year graduation rate of 100%, what are you saving it for? So the answer is yes, you are allowed to. But the more definitive answer is, it really depends upon what your students' needs are clearly demonstrated to be.
Great. So our next question is, can you clarify the role of the STEM administrator, department head or above, that should be part of the leadership and management team?
Okay. I'm going to paint a scenario for you to see if that might clarify some of this. You have a proposal, and it promises that there will be resources from the respective department if it is focused on a single discipline. Let's say chemistry, since that's my home department from ages ago. So it's a proposal about chemistry scholars, and the chemistry department is going to pony up some degree of support. You will have access to reassigned or released time from teaching as a function of being on a grant. And your department chair is the person with signature authority on all of those actions with regards to departmental resources and teaching workload. If your department chair or someone above the department chair is not there to vouchsafe all of the commitments that are made in your proposal, we're going to worry. Because if you don't have that support from above in writing, it could be taken away from you regardless of your having this NSF award. Now, we live in the real world and these things do happen. The rug does get pulled out. So having the firm commitment that someone with signature authority is got your back is why that particular piece of directive is incorporated in the solicitation. If you have a multidisciplinary proposal, you know, biology, chemistry, physics, and math, the classic four, it would be more appropriate to have someone in the dean's office because they're going to have signature authority across multiple departments in order to vouchsafe the promises made for the project. If you're still unsure as to the STEM administrator piece, please do resend the question with a little more detail if you need.
So it looks like we're starting to move through our list of questions here. So remember to keep adding them into the Q&A feature. If you maybe have added something to the chat previously, go ahead and move that over to the Q&A just to make sure we don't miss anything during today's discussion. So our next question for you, Tom, is related to the question about the STEM administrator. How much effort is expected to be dedicated to them?
As much as required by the project. You know, we don't put any sort of benchmarks or stipulations or thresholds into this because every institution is different. I used to be an associate dean. I was on a 12-month contract. I could not be paid extra money from an NSF award to do the things that I was involved with as they pertain to NSF grants. However, I did make a commitment in writing that a certain percentage of my time in the overall 12-month contract was going to be dedicated to facilitating those promises that were made. And it is as much as the project plan requires of that individual. There are some where the dean just has to make sure that all the checks get signed. There are some where the dean is an active participant in a lot of the activities on the ground. And so with those level of differences, there's no single number that captures what that commitment needs to look like.
So another question here for you, Tom. How far back should we go to include discussions of lessons learned from prior S-STEM and STEP awards? And is this different for the lead institutions versus sub-award institutions?
So with regard to prior NSF, S-STEM, or STEP awards, you have to go back to the origin of the program, which dates back to about 2004, if I remember when S-STEM was formally stood up out of CSEMs. The second question, if you're talking about sub-awards, I'm not sure. If it was collaborative submissions, then each collaborative institution would also need to attend to that requirement because they are an institution of record on the proposal. I might need to get back to you on the sub-award question. Mike, Elise, any thoughts?
Not about the sub-award piece. I was just going to say quickly in terms of, you know, what to include. I mean, I think there's a couple of purposes for kind of going back and tracking lessons learned. I think on the one hand, there's sort of just the, you know, the fact that your institution could kind of pull it off. I mean, these are kind of sometimes there's a lot going on with these projects, right? And so a couple of successful prior S-STEM awards, even if it was a decade ago, kind of suggest that there was some of the institutional infrastructure there. And then also to really build on and leverage particular lessons that you learned, right? So if you did these specific, if you had specific interventions, you know, things that you learned, I think it's powerful and it impresses reviewers to build on that. And it might be the case that, you know, very little tweaks were necessary. Like, hey, things really worked very well. And so, you know, it's not like you have to always reinvent the wheel and change things just for the sake of changing them, but really just trying to kind of discuss, show that you've been reflective about, you know, the prior projects, and then make a case for how you're kind of growing and building on those.
As for the subawards, the language reads report as put forth in the PPPG, and then additionally, if there are. So I believe our interpretation would be if the subawardees will be awarding scholarships, you should report on the scholarship, the former S-STEM and STEP projects, because we want to know how you're building upon that. So including an institution as a subawardee still requires you to ensure that the disciplines are not overlapping within 3 years, and there are a number of other places where the requirements requirements apply equally to subawardees versus a collaboration from multiple institutions. So given the wording of that, I think and what I know our intention was in writing it, I would say you should discuss prior STEM and STEP awards at any institution that is awarding scholarships.
Very helpful clarification. Thank you to all three of you. Our next question is, we are considering a track 2 proposal to follow a track 1 proposal that we are closing out. I worry that all of the employee turnover and COVID adaptations on our track 1 project would impact our application for a track 2 proposal. I'm wondering how the challenges of the COVID years are understood in the consideration of implementation grant applications.
So I'm going to emphasize that the review process for proposal submissions involves a substantial peer review before it gets to program officers and goes through a second phase of consideration. And the peers that are serving as the reviewers are all folks like you, many of whom have been operating S-STEM projects over the course of recent history. So they all know how much fun was out there to be had back in 2020 and back in 2021. Okay, this is not a revelation to anyone involved in the S-STEM program. So I would suggest that you simply own it because everybody went through it. I don't have a single annual report from an S-STEM project that wasn't impacted by COVID. I don't have a single instance of anything in my life that wasn't impacted by COVID. So with that in mind, don't shy away from it. But I'm going to be somewhat facetious here. If there's another pandemic in the next 5 years, you should be ready because you went through one already. So this is, this is just more of the same. Lord, I hope it never comes to that again, but there's no assurances in the world we live in. So you had the track 1 and things happened a certain way. As Elise had intimated, what happened informs what you will do moving forward because this is how it shakes out. And so if there's employee turnover, if there were adaptations due to COVID, then you now recognize that this is a very fluid type of circumstance within the S-STEM program. And your ability to make those adjustments is an asset of your project team. So own it and explain how the experience has prepared you to move forward with the larger scale project within the context of track 2.
Thank you also. Oh, go ahead.
So
Elise.
if I can just add to that too, I mean, I agree, and I think it's a good question. And I just, one way to maybe address something that Tom said too is, I think, having even just a couple of sentences here and there related to like contingencies can be really helpful, right? So I think we've probably all learned a lot about kind of contingency plans because of COVID. And I think showing a little bit of foresight based on that, like what will you do if you can't recruit the scholars that you think you will, and just getting out in front of that a little bit can be effective. And then there's a broader point to be made that I was going to raise with regard to the question of like funding the 5th year, which is that you're making your best guess, but there is some room for flexibility, right? I mean, you're proposing cohort sizes and scholarships based on prior data, and so there may be like, oh, we're proposing a cohort of size 8, but we have 9 really outstanding students or 10, and so that's going to affect, it's a long project. And so that might mean you have to kind of adjust cohort sizes down the line or whatever. So that's okay. And those types of things happen. And so just a broad comment that, you're making your best guess, but it's okay if there are undoubtedly going to be changes that happen. And we understand that, so just keep that in mind.
These have been really great questions coming in. I definitely around topics like the impact of COVID are certainly things that I'm sure a lot of people are wondering about. So thanks for raising that up for the NSF colleagues to address today. Our next question is, are the promised course releases and unpaid commitment you referred to not considered cost share, since they are not in the proposed budget and just in the letters of support? I know that voluntary committed cost share is prohibited.
Okay. Cost shares, there's a needle that you have to thread here. Cost share that is presented in a proposal solely for the purpose of making the proposal more attractive is forbidden. So you can't say that if we get this award, the dean's going to match it. So anything that is embedded solely on the contingency of the award from this proposal being made is forbidden. Now, that is a different proposition than saying we have funds that are available and are part of an institutional practice or institutional policy. And if we get the award, we have access to those and we will use those funds to leverage more effect out of the project. So for instance, if your institution has a travel fund for students to present their research, and you're saying part of what you're going to do is support students to do undergraduate research over their second year, third year summer. And by the way, there's this pot of money that will actually pay for them to travel and present the results of that research. That is not a cost share. That is a facilities, equipment, and other resource bit. And you can actually embed it in that part of the proposal because that is a standing policy or a standing practice of the institution to have those funds available. It is not something that you made up solely for the purpose of trying to get an NSF award. So anything that is, when I was a faculty member, we had a standing policy that if you got a grant, you got a course and a half release, regardless of what grant it was. And so that wasn't to get the grant, that was simply a consequence of getting the grant. So that's the parsing that you need to be aware of with regard to cost share or not.
Great. So our next question is, the measures of low income status that were mentioned, TRIO or HUD definitions, for example, would require our having access to student financial information that we do not currently have in order to make estimates of eligible students. It sounds like we will change with the new SAI, but do you have any recommendations about how to approach it with just having EFC for now?
Okay. You as faculty have no business sticking your nose into financial data. You need to collaborate with your Office of Financial Aid, bring them chocolate, bring them cupcakes, whatever it takes, and ask them to assemble this data for you, because you having your nose in that financial data probably violates a whole host of confidentiality laws in FERPA. All right, and so for any S-STEM project, there's a number of constituencies on campus that need to be a part of the enterprise. No PI team of faculty is qualified to speak authoritatively to every part of what has to be in place for an S-STEM project. And it's structured that way on purpose, because this needs to be a campus effort, not a department effort or a school effort. So the Office of Financial Aid, and the reason that the required letter is there is so that we know you've actually had a conversation with financial aid and they understand that if this happens, that they have work to do. And so the commitment from them and the promise that they will follow through and give you the financial output that you need to make those determinations is an important part of the proposal. Okay, and similarly, if there are other pieces of your proposal that require other partners on campus, make for sure that you have engaged with them in advance of submitting this proposal, because you will discover people don't like surprises of that sort.
Great, thanks, Tom. Next up, we have, are we allowed and encouraged to include letters of collaboration in addition to the required letter from the financial aid office?
So once again, you'll hear this answer from me in a lot of contexts. It depends. If you have partners that are doing substantial work and is described in the project description, then yeah, sure. The project description says what they're going to do. The letter of collaboration verifies that, yes, I know that I have been promised to do this, and I agree that I will do this if this award is made. So they're complementary pieces, and you are welcome to include letters of collaboration or letters of commitment. I'm going to step into the naughty part of this and say, you are not allowed to include letters of support. What's the difference? A letter of support is a letter from someone who is not being tasked with any of the work within the project. They are simply putting their stamp of approval on the notion of this project. So for instance, if your provost is not doing any work whatsoever except for taking credit for you being great faculty and getting grant money for the institution, the provost should not be giving a letter of support. If they are not making any work commitments, they have no business putting in an endorsement. If your local congressman sends you a letter and says, I think it would be great if you got an S-STEM award because Congress wrote the legislation for S-STEM and this is just my people getting what they deserve, that letter of support from your congressman will disqualify your proposal because it is a letter of support, not a letter of commitment. So please make sure that you have that clear as to what is being asked.
And can I just add, in case anybody's not familiar, the letter of commitment in the proposal guide, there's a very specific template of language that is like, if the work in this proposal, if this proposal is funded, the work that is described is what I will do. And that's really the limit of the letter of commitment. And in case, maybe Tom said this, I'm sorry if he did, but a lot of the reason is because those letters of support can be perceived as sort of adding content to the project description, right? So if you have a bunch of letters that are adding extra, information that you couldn't fit into the 15 pages, that's why it's sort of would be open to being returned without review if you have those letters of support. So be very careful about that. That's one of those kind of tricky things that can get you into trouble. So I want to mention that.
Really appreciate offering up that distinction there for people as they're preparing their proposals. The next question we have is, we recognize at our institution that we need to hire someone to help implement the project non-research. What percentage of the grant can go to hiring support staff?
Less than 40%, because 60% has to be in scholarships. Beyond that, my tried and true answer, it depends. How much work are they going to do? How much space do you have in the budget, given all of the other commitments, financially speaking, that you need to make for your proposal? How much space do you have? How much are you willing to move out of faculty and staff and into this, this coordinator position, if that's what you're looking for? This is where it gets complicated. It's a dance. You're going to have to basically make choices and make compromises. There's no limitations. The hiring of somebody has to fall within the guidance of your institutional policies as far as hiring anybody new or reassigning anybody new in terms of their workload and salary. So all of those elements have to go into the calculation of how much someone like this would have to get paid. And it depends.
So our next question is, if your cohort is small, say 6, and we have 3 cohorts, is this impact enough? This is a small school, 700 or so students.
So to that, I will say, The goal of the S-STEM program is to increase the participation of academically talented low-income scholars and facilitate their attainment of degree completion. If you have 6 in a cohort and you graduate 6 in a cohort, that's a pretty good outcome. And if your project is appropriately scaled for those 6 students, then there's no reason for you to be embarrassed or look askance at the fact that you're supporting those 6 students. So scale is not an issue. The clarity of how you achieve maximum completion of degrees in STEM is really the target here. And in the portfolio for the entirety of the S-STEM ecosystem, there are ranges of scholars from 6 per cohort to 85 per cohort, 230 per cohort. The size of the cohort is not the issue. It is how many students can you guarantee reach the attainment of the degree.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I mean, I agree with everything Tom said, but there's also, there's a real opportunity for you to kind of make a case for your institutional context, right? So we understand that there are many different types of institutions, and so if you are at you have a relatively small number of students or whatever, that's totally fine. And so I think you can sort of build your case for why this size, why these students, and that can be really strong. So there's not a particular number that we are looking for. And then one just related piece that I can't remember if we've said it in this webinar yet, but I don't think so. But we are more interested in more fully supporting students than not like smaller scholarships to more students, right? So we would rather see a smaller cohort where we're maximizing their unmet need to the extent that we can, than inflating kind of the sizes of cohorts with smaller scholarships. Because to Tom's point, like we want to help students graduate. Yeah.
Just to double down on a couple of things that Elise said. First of all, not only do we want to see it, you are required to fill up your scholars. You're required to award the largest scholarships you can. So either the maximum amount or the student's unmet need, whichever is lower. Okay, so you actually do not, that previously you did, you no longer have the option of saying we're going to award 100 $500 scholarships instead of 10 $5,000 scholarships on average, or something like that. And the other thing, just to plus, more than +1, +7, what Elise said about you have a chance to make a case for your institutional context. I'll go further and say some of our strongest proposals tell the story of the institution and the students that are going to be served. Reviewers often give the feedback, why this here? What this feels very generic. This feels like someone who isn't even associated with the institution wrote something that just sort of sounds good in general. They're maybe not quite that harsh, but that's the message. So work as hard as you can to build the context of your institution, the stories of what you know about your students, why you're putting together the suite of things you're putting together, that into your proposal. That is going to help proposers feel some sort of bond with what you're writing. S-STEM proposals have a lot of things in common because we have a lot of requirements for what you have to do. And the way to distinguish, one way, there are many ways to distinguish your proposal, is to make it really thoughtfully and clearly centered on the students, what they are telling you, what they need, not what we hope they need or what some sort of generic discussion of students regionally or nationally need.
More great advice from all of you. Thank you again. Our next question is, I'm currently co-PI on Track 2 S-STEM grant in its 3rd year, and I'm working on Track 3 S-STEM grant. So how to report on the earlier grant intellect merit and broader impact?
So I think the question is framed in the context of not having a lot of time to have gleaned anything out of the current project. And please, if I am incorrect in that, please do correct me. So even with just 3 years under in your belt, you've presumably learned some stuff, because simply the ramping up of getting to a stage of providing scholarships to these students has taught you something. If it hasn't, then we need to have a whole different kind of conversation. And so with that in mind, this is not about publications. This is not about pushing out some sort of press release. This is about establishing your bona fides to facilitate the success of your students. So that is the primacy of intellectual merit, and it is simultaneously the broader impact, because every student that you help graduate that might not have gotten there on their own is an impact, and it's a big one. So I don't know that I can get into anything without getting into specifics, but that's the merit and the impact of S-STEM. What did you do? How have you moved the needle? What has changed on your campus? How are the students doing?
Great. And as Tom mentioned, if any additional clarification is needed on any of these questions, feel free to drop that back into the Q&A feature or send Rachel a message. We'll make sure that you get your questions answered fully. Our next question is, say we give a student an S-STEM scholarship year 1. Can we then state that 1, as long as they continue to have unmet need and a minimum GPA, they can continue to receive money through year 5 or graduation. But if one of these is then no longer true, that scholar is removed from the pool and a new scholar can be brought in.
At a bare minimum, that is allowable. However, I'm pretty confident that the reviewers are going to pose the question, are you really going to cut bait without a probationary period on a scholar? And so remember, we're all human, and these students in particular don't have all of the benefits of supports or knowing to take advantage of supports that maybe some other students might. So yes, if after every possible effort, a student has failed to maintain their academic credentials, if you're using GPA as the academic talent metric, or if they no longer qualify as low income, that's actually happened on occasion, then yes, they're not eligible and therefore cannot continue to receive scholarship funds. However, if academic performance goes a little sideways, do you really want to lose that student for all perpetuity? And that's a moral, ethical question, but I think it's also salient to what is the driving force behind the project that you're trying to put together.
I'll also say that in that question, something that makes my ears prick up and that I think could raise the hackles of some of our team is minimum GPA. We have very carefully tried to encourage the community to have, for instance, holistic selection policies and processes for your scholars. GPA is an important data point. We can argue whether GPA is what it means, and that's really institutionally dependent in terms of telling you whether or not a student is talented. You know, some programs use STEM GPA as one of their data points as opposed to GPA. There's a lot of possibilities for what you could use there. But, you know, our philosophy is you really need to look at the whole scholar. And falling below a certain GPA line, I think we would probably all come to an agreement that there is some point when if the GPA is so low that you really need to be sure that probation is in play. But one of the things we like to say is the only criteria for keeping an S-STEM scholarship once awarded is, well, there's really two. One, maintaining financial eligibility. You have to remain low income and have unmet need. But beyond that, you just have to be making satisfactory academic progress. You can do that with a 2.5. Now, maybe you want to try to encourage students, especially ones with high talent and high potential. You can support them and help them build that up from there. There are plenty of reasons to encourage students to push themselves. I think we see that all the time. But satisfactory academic performance is intentionally broad because the end goal of the program is to provide opportunities to students who, under many circumstances, regardless of their talent, would not be able to get through their degree programs, and get them through those degree programs and out into the next stage of their life, either the STEM workforce, hopefully, or a STEM graduate program. So just keep that in mind, that first of all, GPAs are an imperfect measure of a lot of things, and sort of a cold measure of a lot of things as well, but also satisfactory academic progress, get them to and through the degree. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, and I'll just add one point because I agree with what Mike and Tom both said. And I think another way to think about that, I was looking at your question, Susan, is that it's also not bad to have thought through contingencies, like we've said. So I think you want to extend sort of as much grace and as possible. I mean, right, we don't want to just turn them out on their ear, but maybe somebody transfers or maybe they switch majors, right? I mean, that is also kind of can happen. And so it's good to think about what will happen if you lose some students in that first year cohort. Will you replace them? Will you just go with a smaller cohort? So I wanted to comment that I think that's a good thing to think through, but I agree that I think wanting to kind of be as compassionate as you can toward your students is a plus here.
Oh, thanks so much for touching on some of the nuances as we think about questions like that. Our next question is, if we want to admit new transfer students to our institution is highly selective. If strategic enrollment management and financial aid are able to identify students who meet all the qualifications, do students actually need to apply, or can they just be offered the scholarship with program requirements?
So from a mechanical point of view, if that is how scholarships are sent out and remitted to students, you could simply give them the check, or I would say cut the check against the cost of attendance. However, all of the other things that go on within S-STEM in terms of the academic supports, the potential to participate in mentoring activities, all of those things require engagement with the scholars. And so just anonymously giving them money falls well short of a level of engagement that is actually going to allow them to embrace the notion that they're an S-STEM scholar. And bit of a tangent here, sorry. This is an opportunity to go onto the soapbox. Mike and Elise are now afraid. S-STEM scholars, and I've put some effort into moving the language of the solicitation and all of our documentation around so that the first words that describe our scholars is academically talented. Low income is not the first thing we care about. They are academically talented. These are scholars. These are not charity cases. Therefore, if you're simply giving them money, how are they going to identify themselves as scholars? And if you've had the opportunity to read the AAAS REC report on student belonging, that affect is a crucial piece of how pretty much any scholar develops their sense of how they become a STEM practitioner. So the logistics of giving them the money, sure. But how are you going to follow up such that those scholars are cognizant of the fact that they are scholars? Because if you don't do that for them, the solicitation says outright, the money by itself is not sufficient.
Thanks for that, Tom. Our next question.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Mike.
Jane, you put something in the chat, this was appropriate for the chat because it wasn't a follow-up question, but they would only accept the scholarship if they agreed to engage/embrace.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit more about that. We have an in-house program called Cal Poly Scholars, which is Cal Poly SLO Scholars, is a similar model where students who are admitted are identified by financial aid and strategic enrollment management as meeting the requirements,
Criteria.
the minimum requirements for the program. And as part of their financial aid package, they are offered the opportunity to join the Cal Poly Scholar community. Joining the Cal Poly Scholar community has many commitments built into that. So they have to meet with particular advisors, they have to live in a learning community, they have to go to events, they have to be part of the cohort. And so many students say yes to that because they get a $3,000 scholarship and a computer. But students who don't want to participate in that, who want to be free at Cal Poly, then turn down the scholarship opportunity because they don't want to make program commitments. We're just trying to figure out project timeline so it's faster. We want to offer in between when they're accepted and when they have to come. And so it's easier if we say, you've been awarded the scholarship, come to this info session to find out more about what the commitments are, rather than you've been admitted to Cal Poly, you're eligible for the scholarship, please apply for the scholarship. We hope to get back to you before you have to make the decision date about.
So I'll defer. Tom's answer was great about that part of the question, but I wanted to make sure that we highlighted the thing that you followed up with, and because this is important for everyone, and this is something that does result in proposals getting declined. You cannot require an S-STEM scholar to do anything except make satisfactory academic progress if they're otherwise eligible. Once you have identified, and Jane, you're nodding, and we've had conversations. I think you and I have spoken before, and I think you understand that. But I just want to make sure everyone understands, because people make this mistake, and we decline based on this, depending on how strong the language is. Sometimes, once you have determined, hopefully holistically, that a student is talented and that they meet the financial criteria, you cannot require them to do anything. You can strongly encourage. You can lay out a compelling argument why all these things are going to make a huge difference in their success. You can develop an ornate tap dance number to try to convince them. We don't care about any of that. You cannot require them to do anything to get or keep the scholarship, and you cannot make willingness to do anything a criteria for getting the scholarship.
Okay.
And so, Jane, I'm not finger waggling at you. I just want to make sure everybody understands.
So just very quickly, I know time is pressing. If we identified they're admitted, financial aid strategic enrollment management says, hey, there's this great program. It's a scholarship and mentoring program, includes these activities. Are you interested in it? It could be a shorter. Right now, we have a pretty extensive application, so students are basically applying twice. And this is a question from my strategic enrollment management team, which is our admissions office. They just wanted us, if there's any way to reduce the burden of the application for incoming transfer students, which is our target population, where they don't have to go through what we're currently doing for the application process.
Understood completely. And assuming you identify that you may identify more talented students than you have slots, and then there's other considerations. But if you can lay out for our for our reviewers a clear and appropriate way that you're going to identify who you want to offer this to. Trying to expedite other aspects are fine. My only response was about, because just to make sure people understand that even things that we know are good for the scholars can't be required. The program and the government's view is that a scholarship is not pay for work. And again, Jane, again, we have talked before, so I know you understand this, but people do make this mistake. And so since you mentioned it, I wanted to make sure that we tried to save anyone any heartbreak because of a well-meaning, but we know mentoring is going to help. So do we. We understand that. But a scholarship cannot be paid for any kind of activity. I also want to thank Olivia Long, who's a program officer on our team, who sent me a private message to make sure I clarified. You cannot require a scholar to do anything that you're not requiring all students to do. If there is a degree requirement, of course, you can tell them, in engineering, they can't be like, well, I'm not doing senior design. S-STEM says you can't. That's not how that works. You can, any requirements that hold for all students in the same degree program hold for S-STEM. You can't require them to do anything extra for their degree unless it's part of their degree, specifically their degree program. Thanks, Olivia.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that additional clarification, Mike and Olivia, and for clarifying your question there, Jane. We have another question, and we are slowly coming up on our 4:30 Eastern cutoff time, so we will probably only have time for this and maybe one more at this point. So I'll go ahead and share this one with you, Tom. Can funds be used to pay for summer courses for students, either at their own institution or another institution? We find this is a large financial barrier for students that impacts their ability to complete their degree in 4 years.
So most of this is aligned with the degree program. And so if you're going to construct a pathway across 8 semesters or 10 semesters that supports the student, once again, with the objective of getting them to graduation, getting them to walk across that podium, the allocation of the scholarships needs to align with whatever the established curriculum guidelines are. So the scholarships must pay for cost of attendance, and the institutions typically require that that be a fall/summer endeavor. And as soon as you reach the threshold of $15,000 for an undergraduate, $20,000 for a graduate student, that's what you can do. I understand the need to provide some flexibilities, but unless the summer work is required for the degree, it's problematic to think about trying to support the students in that particular space because there's still plenty of cost involved with the strict academic terms. So I am going to encourage you to shy away from that sort of support.
Thanks, Tom. Our next question is, what is the difference between average GPA that we report in the unmet need table for a certain program and the academic eligibility? So if we determine the required GPA, what is the average that we are reporting?
So you are reporting actual data in that table when providing the average GPA and unmet need for that table. And that is not used as a selection criteria. You are simply establishing who is there, what is their financial need, and what is the status of their retention and/or academic performance. So this has really nothing to do with GPA as a requirement. This is simply a thumbnail sketch of your scholars to inform reviewers, this is what the students look like. And therefore, what you propose to do as a function of your project should be calibrated against that baseline data. So for instance, a lot of proposals will say, our retention in first to second year transition is 45%. And with this S-STEM award, we're going to elevate that to 75%. Unless you have a clear plan and a lot of evidence that that is likely to happen, reviewers are going to interpret that as wishful thinking. And wishful thinking is not something that will serve your scholars particularly well. In the same vein, if you say that your current average GPA is a 2.8 and we're going to raise it to a 3.0 as a function of this S-STEM award, the question is going to be raised, well, how's that going to work? And so that's what the table GPA is about. What you're establishing with your eligibility GPA is basically, hopefully, just a piece of the academic talent picture for these scholars. And so if your average GPA is a 2.8 for your major freshman year, and you say that you need a 3.2 to be a scholar, you've just painted yourself into a pretty prickly corner, because how is that going to work? You basically precluded a lot of your eligible students, and you sort of cast academic talent in a very constrained light. So yeah, so the two GPA reports are sort of attending to different aspects of the proposal.
And please note that the solicitation says this table or similar. So if GPA is not a significant part of your determination or not, you don't have to include that row. It just gives some context. You do need to accurately represent, to the best of your ability, and with some holistic criteria this is difficult, the pool of potential scholars. But the average GPA rows in the solicitation that's an example table, not a mandated table if it doesn't make sense for your project.
Thank you for that as well. So we're moving into our last question here. So thank you all so much for all of your questions. If they did not get answered, I encourage you to reach out to NSF program officers to get additional clarification. There are also a number of resources on the REC website as well as the program page. If you are looking for something in particular, always feel free to reach out to us. Our last question for today, though, is it appropriate to mention in the proposal efforts to use S-STEM funds as last dollar scholarship funds to help the students get additional scholarships so that we can have the best impact, even though that may decrease the amount awarded to an individual, but that would also help to increase the number of students supported?
So Elise mentioned this earlier. In the context of your institution, the S-STEM program is interested in maximizing the probability of success at the individual student level. And the measure of success is a graduate. I'm concerned about any efforts to broaden the scope of a project to increase numbers. Now, this is something that your institution is probably quite interested in, but S-STEM funds as leverage to do other things, A, I'm not quite sure where you would get the other monies to do that, and B, S-STEM is a last dollar scholarship. And so making plans to reduce the amount of obligations against S-STEM awards just strikes me as a really odd way to use the S-STEM program. I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that. So anything that mentions or explicates decreasing the amount awarded to an individual is not going to be received particularly well in the review process or from program officer inspection. That sounds like you're trying to spread a pat of butter across too many pieces of bread. And we're not real happy about you sacrificing a piece of bread just so that you can have another piece of bread.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I can understand the sentiment of like we want to be able to help as many students as possible, like that. I get that, but I think um, there's no need. There's no numerical threshold that we have. It's not like we look at a project and say, oh, they're supporting this many scholars and they're supporting this many scholars, and so this is much better. That's not coming into the calculation. So I think it really is like you're doing all you can. Now, if there are existing other great scholarships that the students are going to get, that's fine. But I don't know that it needs, yeah, that's an effective way to frame the scholarships, like Tom was saying.
With our last few minutes here, I want to ask Tom, Elise, Mike, if you wouldn't mind sharing just some final tips for everyone that's on the webinar for what you've seen in successful proposals or things that maybe people should avoid that are a little bit interesting to navigate in maybe your first proposal. Tom, if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
So I'm going to basically make use of that last question and expound a little bit. The S-STEM program is about the scholars. And I'm going to say something that might be a little bit harsh, but this is just the way it is. The S-STEM program doesn't particularly care about your department, doesn't particularly care about your institution. It cares about your students. Your departments and your institutions are merely the vehicle by which we get those students the support that we hope will facilitate and increase the odds of their success. So as soon as you start to make it about you, you start to erode our confidence that you understand what the goal of this program is. So remember, the benchmark is successful graduation with the degree. And the question you should ask yourself in any activity you incorporate in your proposal is, how is this increasing the assurance that the students will graduate? And if the answer to that question is, I don't know, I would suggest thinking about taking it out.
Thanks, Tom. Elise, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. I do think we hit a lot of the main points that I think we would normally make. I think two comments. I've been meeting with some STEM-PI's perspective over the past couple of weeks, and so these have sort of emerged as big themes. I think there's sort of two pieces that can really serve your proposal well, and one, as I mentioned, is sort of just, are the numbers there, like very clearly showing your eligible scholar pool, and then that ratio of who you plan to recruit in regards to the pool, and having that just be very clear. Like a reviewer should be able to come away being like, here's exactly the number of scholars they want, here's the and I'm convinced that they have sort of enough of a pool. So there's that numerical piece. And then the other piece I think is really having a clear picture of what the student experience is going to be. So like you are specifically designing some support pieces for your scholars. So whether that's mentoring or a summer bridge program or coursework or whatever, right? And so going into sufficient detail so that the reader can really get a sense of this is what being a scholar at an S-STEM scholar at this institution is going to look like. And so that's going to connect and draw on existing supports at your institution, perhaps, right? Or strengths of your institution, but really being very clear about what those cohort activities are so that the reviewers can get a sense of, yeah, what really are the key features of this. And to not provide too many, like you can't throw the kitchen sink at the scholars. Pick a few that are, or a few that are really gonna leverage the strength of your institution, and then go into sufficient detail about those. So if you say there's going to be faculty mentoring, who's going to train the faculty mentors? Who specifically of the faculty are going to mentor the students? What is the meetings going to look like, right? So that level of detail for the supports that you have for your cohort, I think really can strengthen the proposal.
Thanks so much, Elise. And Mike, any advice you have to wrap up today?
I was going to say something that overlapped pretty heavily with Elise, which is, maybe in a slightly different way. Reviewers get kind of itchy if they can't visualize a scholar's pathway through your project. If they don't understand sort of what is going to be in front of them, what are you really asking them to do? What supports are going to be available? they're gonna struggle, and that's when they're gonna start pulling strings, right? So make it as clear as possible. A lot of the things that Elise said are really critically important. About just, okay, they're gonna do this. What is that gonna look like? If you have data that supports a number of different interventions, how are you? I think what Elise said is really important because we see this one a lot. How are you gonna help the scholars decide which ones are right for them or that they have the bandwidth for? But you have to be clear. If they can't picture what a student going through your program is like, they're gonna probably not come out the other side of reading your proposal in a mindset of, oh, this is one we have to invest in. Because this remains a competition. This is a very big program. We get a lot of proposals, and it is competitive. And so that level of clarity is important. And then the other thing I would said aligns with what Tom said. It's about the scholars. What do they need? What do you know about them? Center on them. Center on who they are, who they can be, what they need, and what they bring with them. Think about their strengths and assets. A lot of our scholars have lived life in a richer way than some of their peers who have maybe had a little bit of an easier road financially. That may have made it harder for them to get to you. It may make certain aspects of getting through your programs harder, but dang, is that a weapon that they can use to be not only great students, but great professionals and great contributors to our society. Figure out how to identify that, dig it out, and leverage it, because that's why scholars are special. They're talented, and they do amazing things. They've done amazing things just to get to your doorstep. So.
And that is a great note to end our webinar on, Mike. Thank you so much to everyone who was able to attend today. We appreciate your time and all of your great questions. Thank you to my AAAS colleagues for running everything behind the scenes. They really made sure we got through all of the questions as much as we could. And a big thank you to our NSF partners for taking the time to answer all of these really thoughtful questions. Please complete the webinar survey to give us some feedback about today's session. We really appreciate you taking the time to do that. We encourage you to visit the REC website. There you'll find resources, including webinar slides from today, recordings of this week's webinars, and all of the links that we've posted in the chat. We also welcome you to stay connected with us and help us to build out the community by signing up for our email list and interacting with us on social media. Thank you so much to everyone, and we really look forward to engaging with you in future webinars and other REC activities. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.